Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Creative Land Recycling and the Department of Toxic Substances Control to this webinar. This webinar is for the second round of the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant. My name is Natalie Nava. I am the program manager with the Center for Creative Land Recycling working on this ECRG grant. We're really glad that you joined us today. We got a lot of great applicants and great projects that got funded in the first round from all over the state of California, and we're really grateful that you took the time to be with us today. We know that we are opening the full application in January, but really wanted to give people some early engagement and assistance and get started, give a sneak peek of what's to come and go over some of the grant guidelines and requirements. And so now I'd like to introduce Mariam Tasnif Abbasi. She is with the Office of Brownfields in the Department of Toxic Substances Control.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie, for that introduction. And thank you to all of you who are participating today. Like Natalie said, we're going to be opening up round two of the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant in January. But we're keeping ourselves and everyone else really busy from now until then with a lot of content, a lot of bits and pieces that we're going to release to help you get ahead and prepare. So today's session really is a sneak peek on what's to come so that we can bring more and more of your communities into the Equitable Community Revitalization Grant and fund investigation, assessment, and cleanup work all over. I believe we have a couple of poll questions that have shown up on our screen. Natalie, just didn't know if you wanted to walk people through that or...
Sure, no problem.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we have just a couple poll questions just because we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. So the first question is, what level of familiarity do you have with the ECRG program already? I'm not familiar with ECRG at all. We've been doing outreach, and so we definitely want to see if we're reaching people. I've heard a little bit about it. I have familiarity with the program and have attended webinars or even gotten assistance from CCLR. I am entirely familiar with ECRG as I have applied in the past. The second question is, do you have a site already in mind for this next round of ECRG funding? Yes or no? And we'll give you a minute or so to answer. And then the third question is, what type of assistance will you need to submit an ECRG application? We'll go over this later, but CCLR does provide a number of different things that we can support you all with. So some of the options here are just like overview of ECRG, what it is, and we'll go over some of that today. But there's always lots of details to go through. Eligibility, which is of course really important. Site selection, looking over your application or looking over your budget and schedule. So it looks like I will let Devin, you can keep it up on the side if you'd like for a little bit. I don't know how many people have answered.
So why don't we do this, Natalie? Why don't I move on to the next slide, which is just basically talking about what today's presentation is. And whenever you're ready to share those poll responses, just let me know. We can switch back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so these are some of the things that we're going to be covering today. We're going to kind of walk through a very broad overview of what the ECRG is. We're going to share with you who our current cohort of ECRG grantees are. I think for those of you who did participate in the last round, I wanted to share a little bit with, of the differences between round one and round two. And we'll talk about the upcoming items that we had that we want you to be aware of, basically our ECRG calendar. And I think what's really important part of us starting the sneak peek several months ahead of the opening of our actual application process is we really want everyone to get ahead and get prepared for sending in an ECRG application. And then, of course, we have resources and information and assistance that's available to you to develop an application. And Natalie's going to speak to that a little bit more, more specifically to help everybody understand how they can get free help in putting these applications together.
Okay, next slide.
So Nellie, did you want to share poll questions, poll responses before I get into the ECRG?
Yeah, go ahead, Devin, you can share them. It looks like we're getting a lot of responses.
If it's
Okay,
still
here it is. We've got 15% not familiar with ECRG at all. 54% have heard a little bit. 13% are familiar and have attended some webinars, and 19% have are familiar and applied last time. So that's good to hear. There's some people interested in coming back. Do you have a site already in mind? 71% said yes, 29% said no. And it looks like we have it's about 50 to 60%, 65% for all of the support that people need. So we're CCLR will be happy to provide that well-rounded support.
wonderful. Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, I put it in the chat, but please, if people can ask their questions in the chat, we'll take Q&A at the end. It's a pretty short presentation, so we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you for that reminder, Natalie. And I encourage everyone to go ahead and pop their questions in as they think of them. Like Natalie said, we do have a lot of time scheduled and not a lot of content, so we'll try and get to questions and answer all of the ones that are asked. So this is a quick overview of where the ECRG funds came from. In 2021, the Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities initiative was funded, where $500 million were allocated to DTSC to focus on cleanups and reuse of brownfields in California. And there was a very, very strong focus on vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. The ECRG is the biggest piece of this program. We have about $270 million in funding. About $75 million was used in round one. There's the Discovery Enforcement program that focuses on dry cleaning sites throughout the state. We have workforce development, some orphan site funding, and then technical assistance grants and community benefits agreements. So workforce development, technical assistance grants, and community benefit agreements, they're still very early stages. And if you want more information, you can go to our website. This is a cheat sheet that we created for each one of you to understand better what the other CVCI programs are. But I'm not going to go through it. You can take a look at that at your own leisure. And we've got hyperlinks to contact people if you want more specific question answered about these other CVCI programs. The ECRG is a grant for public entities, nonprofits, and tribes to conduct community-wide assessments, site-specific investigations, and site-specific cleanups. It is a competitive process, and the application can be submitted online. We are in the second of 3 rounds, as we've mentioned before. So for this round, we have, I think, a little bit less than $100 million available. And just so you know, this is a reimbursement grant, which means that we don't provide, a cash lump sum to our grantees. They are given a funding allocation. They send us invoices, and we give them checks to make those payments through this reimbursement system. It is, as I mentioned, focused on vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. So how do we determine these vulnerable and disadvantaged communities? Basically, what we do is that we use a database called CalEnviroScreen. CalEnviroScreen is developed by another state agency. And what it does is that it intersects different sorts of social demographies related to at-risk populations with geographies that carry pollution burdens. They use information from DTSC, from the water boards, air pollution data, cleanup information. So there's a lot that goes into coming up with a scoring system, or it's a percentile score. And these red areas that are on the map in front of you are the areas that have the highest CES scores. So our program is, prioritizes these areas that are 75% or higher. We will definitely consider applications that have lower scores if the primary goal of the reuse is to support a vulnerable population or a community. For score areas with scores that are less than 50%, these are disfavored in the application process. However, we do recognize that there are a lot of communities where there is a need to clean up and address brownfields that for many reasons don't score high. And so in the application, if you take a look at last year's application, there are ways for rural communities, tribal communities, to still participate in this process. That's just sort of some deeper information that we asked for I thought for this session was not really going to get into that. But if anyone is interested, definitely reach out to us and we can walk you through that. So you'll begin, for those of you who are familiar with our offering in round one, you'll already see some differences. For community-wide assessments, there's a fixed number that everyone has to apply for, $350,000. There's a range available for site-specific investigations, anywhere from $80,000 to up to $3 million, and site-specific cleanups that go up to $7 million. For the sites, there has to be a reason that the site, that you think the site is or might be contaminated. Reuse is really important because we have very strong focus on cleanup to build up. So all of our applications must have some reuse plans in place. And we are focusing on sites that are incorporating equitable development principles, that are looking to alleviate environmental justice and promote equity in whatever reuse they are planning for these particular sites. We have a funding term for 2 years, which basically means that when you develop your scope and your budget for your ECRG application, you have to think about like where you are in your investigation, assessment, or cleanup process, and ask for what work you can complete within the 2-year grant funding term. Regulatory oversight is required for the investigation and cleanup grants. Because it is really important for us that decisions are made in a manner that's safe and protective of what the proposed reuse is. And a circular liability defense is required. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that's basically responsibility for contamination. And it's probably, I would say, one of the more intense aspects of the application, just because through a series of questions and answers that are provided by you as applicants, we try to get to that circular liability defense. So these are our awardees for our last round. We have 53 different awardees who are working on a total of 84 different sites, because our community-wide assessments have multiple sites in them. We awarded the entire $70 million allocation that we had for the last fiscal year, and actually funded some projects from the amount that was available to us for this fiscal year as well. Most of our applications were for, the most highest dollar figure were for cleanups, which sort of made sense. And then we've got the middle tier, we have investigation, and then the lowest awarded amount were for community-wide assessments. And the big majority of our projects were for those highest Calamar screen scores that I talked about earlier. Now, if you look at our geographic distribution, this is something we'll talk about a little bit more, but most of our represented geographies are concentrated in Southern California and Northern California, urban centers, and generally around those areas, with a little smattering of a few projects, as you can see, as outliers. I love this slide. This slide makes me really happy. This is a representation of all the different communities we've funded who are making up the first cohort of our ECRG grantees. So for those of you who are familiar, were familiar, or participated in some way in our last and first round of the ECRG, here are some of the differences. So last year, it was a new offering. So we had a very specific pre-application round where people could apply using kind of the eligibility focused questions, and we actually, went through them, checked them, and provided some feedback. From our conversations with a lot of our stakeholders who, gave us feedback, it seemed that pre-application was useful because people were able to kind of decide whether or not they even met qualifications and got some confirmation from us. And so this year, we're going to be introducing an eligibility self-check tool that allows you to go through a series of questions to determine whether or not you meet the eligibility criteria. We've got about 100 million available instead of last year's 70 million. Like I mentioned, our community-wide application numbers have changed a little bit. The Calendar screen score, the version's been updated between rounds, and so we're going to be using Calendar screen 4.0 instead of 3.0. I think one of the new requirements that's going to require a little bit more effort on our applicants' part is requesting a letter from your regulatory oversight agency if it isn't DTSC. And so we're currently working with the Water Board and the AB 304 certified local agencies on that process. But and we'll have more information about this in one of our ECRG Genius webinars. But the idea is that if DTSC isn't a lead agency, go to your AB 304 local agency or your Water Board or whoever it is that you're working with. And we've given them a format and a template to use where they will incorporate your site-specific information, look at your work history together, and then give us a copy of your agreement, your regulatory oversight agreement, and this sort of checklist that we're asking for so we can understand these sites a little better. We're also asking that the applicant be a party to the regulatory oversight agreement. And there is a very specific reason for doing this, because we are a reimbursement-based grant, and our checks can only go to our grantees. And so in our current cohort, we saw a lot of situations where we have funded a grantee, but somebody else is doing the work. And there were just some questions that were related to that. So, we're going to work with our current cohort and find a path to success. But I think it's going to be a lot easier for us if our applicant is the one who's party to the regulatory oversight agreement. And so that is also something that we're going to talk about in a little bit more depth in one of our upcoming ECRG Genius webinars. We're also working on a process for inclusion of certain types of water board orders. But right now, if we look at round one information, any site that has any kind of administrative or enforcement order on it is not eligible for ECRG. So we're working with the water board to expand that a little bit. And that's something else that hasn't been, like the logistics of that hasn't been decided, but we're in the last phases of negotiating that. And because we did not have grantees last year, this current cohort is in fact our first cohort. So we do have a 60% spend requirement for existing grantees. So if you are an existing ECRG grantee, then you would have had to show 60% of your total allocation needed to have been invoiced to us already by the time the application closes. So these are some updates that I want to provide, and this is basically on who needs that circle liability defense or not. And this is such sort of a complex component of our application. I just want to kind of bottom line it in different categories for the purposes of this webinar. So for applicants who are owners, for community-wide assessments, you don't need to show a circle liability defense, but you do need to show it for investigations and cleanups, which basically means that when you took title to the property, you conducted environmental due diligence at the same level that was customary at the time. For applicants who are not the owners, once again, for community-wide assessments and for site-specific investigations, actually, that's not needed. But if you are not an owner and you are working with someone else, that owner then needs to establish this CERCLA liability defense. And then there's some additional attestations that we're asking for that are worded a little bit differently, and that's something that you guys can take a look at when you go back through these slides. And then we've got some additional questions for applicants who aren't the owners, because we just want to make sure that the applicant has plans to ensure that this property is going to be reused, right? Because they're further away from being able to make it happen if they're not actually the owners of the site. And so, the biggest way to address that is that an applicant who needs this money to be able to reduce their environmental uncertainties, and then they plan to purchase. And so that question is being asked. And then I think a general question that we're also asking about the current owner is that if they are financially solvent and able to pay for the cleanup themselves. And if they're not, we're just curious as to how you make this determination. And if they are financially solvent, we want to understand why the ECRG funds are being requested. So these are some of the things that are sort of different from last time. And in this overview, I just wanted to go ahead and share that with everyone who's in attendance today. And so, I think the more important question is, what is DTSC looking for? What are we looking for in this round? So definitely, we're going to continue to look for sites in these highest Callan virus screen score areas. We're looking for projects that have like strong narratives that show us that when these projects and sites are cleaned up and brought to reuse, they're going to provide significant community benefit and be something that the community can really take advantage of and elevate quality of life for everyone who lives there. We also want to say that our funding is critical, and that's another reason why we are working with the more disadvantaged communities, because we would rather enter into these spaces and places where there's little or no funding for cleanup and where our money is essential. We are also quite focused on equitable development. So equitable development is really important to us. We want to make sure that these applications have considered things like displacement and making the post-cleanup benefits available to the local residents. And so in the application, when we ask for equitable development commitments and ask for the metrics that are going to be used to report back to us how those equitable development commitments are going to be met and what their schedule is, we want these to be clearly defined and clearly linked into broader equitable development concepts. We definitely need greater tribal representation this round, and we are willing to do whatever it takes to work with tribes to bring them in. And this is something I alluded to earlier when I was showing you what our map looks like. We really do need a better geographic representation. The Inland Empire, Coachella Valley, far south, far north, these are areas that were just not represented at all. And you can kind of see, once again, like it's a different version of the same map I showed you earlier. We tended to have most of our applications in the urban centers of NorCal and SoCal, but you've got entire swaths of the state that are just without ECRG investment. And so we really want to be able to invest broader in these communities. And so that's something else that's probably going to play a role in our scoring as well. So what are some of the things that are coming up? Well, we'll be releasing our eligibility self-check tool, I think in late October, if not sooner. And like I mentioned, this is basically going to be a little PDF checklist for you that it is going to be somewhat intense. There's going to be a series of questions. There are going to be instructions on how to answer those questions and what to look at. The instructions are going to be very detailed because we want to put as much information out there as possible to give our applicants the ability to prepare ahead of time. And we're also going to have required documents on there. So it'll help you pull some of the more, difficult to get information together, so you're not wasting time when the actual application comes out. We hope that when the application comes out, you're going to be focusing on your strong narratives and you've already pulled together the information that you need to attach. We've got a bunch of different ECRG Genius webinars coming up. This actually should be Brownfield Basics Part 1 and Part 2. Sorry for that typo. We'll fix that before we send this out to you. So Monday, our Brownfield Basics Part 1 is going to talk about the history of brownfields. How did brownfields end up in our communities, and what was the basis for that, and why is it important for communities to be aware of brownfields, and how can communities take advantage of this funding that's available for brownfields. So it's really for those of you who are new to this sector, or who just got thrown into it, who are said, hey, there's money, go get it. This would be a really good session for you. And the second part of the Brownfields Basics is going to cover more technical aspects, which is like taking that brownfield through the process of investigation and cleanup, and what it takes to get it to the point where it is available for safe reuse. And we're also going to be talking about different funding. So we're partnering not only with CCLEAR, but with USCPA on these Brownfield Basics. So we think it's going to be really useful for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about where this came from. Also, in later October, we're going to have a new ECRG Genius on regulatory oversight agreements. That's where we're going to speak some more in some more depth about these new requirements of requiring a letter from and a checklist from your regulatory oversight agency. And by then, we would have had the expanded pathway for the inclusion of water board order sites also all sorted out. So that will be a good one with a lot of new information in it. And then in late October, we'll have a walkthrough on that eligibility self-check tool I had mentioned a couple of times already. And that's going to be another one because even though the self-check is going to be somewhat self-explanatory, there's a lot of information in there. And we just want to make that available to everybody ahead of time and have this accompanied by a webinar to kind of walk everyone through it. We are aiming to release our guidelines ahead of opening up our application. What we're hoping this will do is give people a chance to go through the guidelines without the panic of a looming deadline. So we wish we could have gotten that earlier, but I think looking at our workload and our resources, we'll probably release that sometime in mid to late December. We're planning on opening up our applications in January. We'll have, I believe, 6 to 8 weeks for the application to be open to work on it, and then we'll have a deadline in March. Our decisions will be released in June. We'll have agreements executed in that June-July timeframe, and the authorization to spend happens on the date that the agreement is executed. So really, at that point, it's just a matter of getting signatures before work can begin. These are just, an FYI. There's this is a list of webinars that we're planning, and we've got it. We don't have all of these hard scheduled yet, but at least it's what we're planning. So you can see the different webinars that we have coming up even in the new year. And we've got a new one-pager that just is a snapshot of information, and this is basically a hyperlink to that. So you can take a look at our one-pager, which is our new overview of round 2. So where to get help? Let's see. So use the resources on the ECRG website. There's a lot of information there. We have information for our current grantees in case anyone who's an applicant is interested. That's a good place to go to see what the grantee experience is and what kind of information we're sharing with them. there's a new grantee or new applicant page that has information from last time. Until we get information from this time ready, we want to make sure all that old information is available to you, just so you can start, getting into the mindset and understanding what happened last round, because there will be differences. The differences won't be that drastic. And the self-check tool, when it comes out, we really think that should be used. That's going to be very, very key to early prep, because it's going to help you gather the information that you need and gather the documents that you need. And we also think that the webinars will be helpful because you get an opportunity to see pieces of information at a time and focus content, and you do have the ability to ask those questions. And of course, we think the most important and most helpful thing that DTSC has been able to offer is the services of our Brownfield Technical Assistance Provider, the Center for Creative Land Recycling. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie to talk about how ECRG can help you.
Thank you, Miriam. So the Center for Creative Land Recycling, also known as ECRG, has been around for over 20 years. First working with the EPA in regions 9 and 10, that's who we're the Office of Brownfields. And now we're really thrilled to be working with DTSC on this historic investment in California. And so what the things that we offer is we have a great team. We've been providing one-on-one technical assistance or application assistance. So everything from even if you're not sure what site you want to work on or what project you want to work on, we're happy to help you think through that and really do this early stage project envisioning and thinking through what site is the best site as far as eligibility as well. We have different application focus areas, and so we can go through the application as well, depending on what support you need. And then just in general, we can also just help you build a better ECRG application. Like we said, we could look at budgets, schedules, and as long as you don't send your application the day before it's due, we will have, a deadline up there, but we can also just kind of give, high level comments on your application as well. We can't write your application for you, but we can definitely help you throughout the process. And one thing we can proudly say is that 95% of applicants who worked with us got ECRG funding. So I saw somebody, I said, how can we make sure our application's more competitive? And we're here to help you, to walk you through that process. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is the Calendly link. Devin will put it in the chat, and you'll also get it's in the last newsletter. So make sure you sign up for our email newsletter on the DTSC ECRG website. But here on the this is what the Calendly page looks like, and you can pick the drop down. So these are the times that we'll have one-on-one. We try and have two revitalization specialists, as we call them, to provide application assistance for each call, and they're usually up to about 45 minutes. Sometimes, you do the first initial preliminary thinking through your project, and then later on you come back and want some feedback on your budget, and we're happy to do that as long as time allows. And we haven't turned anyone away from that. We didn't do that last time. We really want to support your successful application. We have a lot of money to give out. DTSC is 100 million. So we really want to help get this money to the communities that need it. Next slide, you can see our team. So we have Ignacio, David, Janet, and Sebastian, who all have their different expertises related to the different parts of the application. And then Devin and I, who are on this call right now. And we also have Tony, who's been doing a lot of outreach support with us. So you're welcome to reach out to us at the ECRG email, as well as sign up for on Calendly for a one-on-one session with us. Okay, and now we have time for questions and answers. So I'm just going to go through them as they started. So let me go back up to Jake. And I'll read the question and then Miriam will answer. Let's see. Jake says, Jake Shimano, can you clarify the recommended timing of applications as it relates to site investigations and cleanup? Can fees paid for ESA/site mitigation/vapor mitigation design install be refunded if funds are spent before award grant received?
Okay, so the answer to that is no. We can only reimburse spending that's done after our grant agreement is signed.
Great, thank you, Miriam. I have another question here from Rashi. Are public schools qualified for this program? And somebody also asked about public school districts. So I said yes, but go ahead and answer, Miriam.
Yes, any entity that is considered to be a government entity, public entity, they are eligible to apply. So generally, school districts are an eligible applicant category.
Yeah, school districts, cities, parks districts, pretty much any public agency, transportation districts. So it's pretty open. Catherine has a question. Can you submit multiple applications? In Catherine's case, having multiple sites to clean up.
Yes. At this time, we are accepting multiple applications from single applicants.
Okay, Jason's question. How can private property owners take advantage of the program, assuming that the property itself qualifies?
So this money is not directly available to private parties, but if a private party is working with a nonprofit or a tribe or a public agency, there is the ability for that collaboration to happen. I did discuss the requirements for owners, earlier in our presentation. So the owners would still have to show that they have a certain liability defense. And we are trying to stay away from funding sites with well-funded owners. And so there is going to be a question as to if there is a private owner who is financially liable, what justifies the use of ECRG funds. And so those are some things to contemplate when entering into a public-private or nonprofit partnership to apply for ECRG.
Great, thank you, Miriam. How do we know if we have an AB 304 local agency?
Okay. So we can maybe, Devin, if you can find the link for our AB 304 resources page and put it in the chat, that would be great. But I think if you just Google DTSC AB 304, we have a page that has a listing of all of the AB 304, I think they're called approved agencies. There's about, I think, 14 right now throughout the state that are qualified to provide regulatory oversight.
Great. Yeah, and that's another resource we can put on the ECRG website if it's not there already. And there'll also be a webinar. I know a lot of people have different levels of understanding. I know me, myself, as an urban planner, was new to regulatory oversight. So we will have a webinar, as Miriam mentioned, specific to that. But let's answer more questions about that since we have people here. So we have another question. Does the site have to be a party to regulatory oversight prior to submitting an application?
Yes, we have a lot of sites that will get into regulatory oversight agreements to be able to apply for the ECRG. So we're not requiring that there be some lengthy history between the site and the applicant and the regulatory agency. It's perfectly acceptable to get into an agreement just to apply for funds. But you do have to do that prior to submitting your application. And that's why regulatory oversight is one of the earlier ECRG Genius webinars that we're putting out to help people kind of work with agencies other than DTSC to get into agreements. When you work with DTSC, we can get you into an agreement fairly quickly, but we are being respectful of other agencies who may have varying timelines. But the answer to that question is that yes, we do have to have that in place prior to submitting your application.
Right, which is why we're trying, getting this information out now, because we understand it can take some time. Okay, Addie has a question. I think just clarifying the 60% for grantees. Providing 60% of invoices prior to application was mentioned. Is this correct?
Yes, so this is correct. We have only, our ECRG grants are only for a 2-year time frame. And we have a lot of current grantees who have multiple grants with us for multiple sites. We don't want to put anyone in a situation where they have more grants from us than they have the capacity to handle. And so coming up with that number of having to have submitted 60% invoices of what your allocated amount is something that we've determined is, shows us that that grantee organization will still have excess capacity to take on more.
Great. Bruce's question, does GeoTracker provide a CalEnviroScreen score like the EnviroStore site does?
I do not know the answer to that question, but part of our application is that we have a little tool that works with CalEnviroScreen. So when you put your address in, you can calculate that. And I'll have someone make a note for me to let's make sure we include that CES tool in our eligibility checklist, just to make it easier for people to get their scores ahead of time.
Yeah, that's great. How can we increase our chance of getting our projects approved for grants?
Well, like I said, I think if you participate in our ECR Genius webinars and get the information that we're providing, because our webinars and our webinar series, we put that together based on the gaps in information and knowledge that we saw in our first round and the number of questions that we got repeatedly on a single topic. We also really looked at when we ended up with our first round of applications, where everyone misunderstood our questions or didn't give us what we needed or where we saw problem areas. And so all of our ECR Genius webinars are based on our response to what we saw. So we highly recommend participating in all of our webinars. We highly encourage the use of the eligibility self-check tool when that gets released in a few weeks. And like I mentioned, more than anything else, work with Natalie and her team at CClear and take advantage of that free assistance, set up these phone calls and meet with Natalie and her team, because they can give you very, very specific guidance that's going to be helpful. And I would say that I think the more people who complete their applications early and get someone from Natalie's team to review that before they submit it, the greater the chances of success.
Great, thank you for the plug, Miriam.
You're quite welcome.
We did answer this, but I'll just say it again. Chul Gucic from Lasar, our grant awards made retroactively, so no work that's already been completed and paid for cannot be covered by ECRG.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Jake Shimano. Are affordable housing developers with a limited ownership interest in a project able to apply for or / qualify for these funds?
You have to be a nonprofit or a public entity or a tribe. And so that's the way I would answer that question, that if you can show 501c paperwork that shows that the majority interest in the organization is owned by that 501c, then you're eligible. If the nonprofit aspect of that particular partnership is less, then no, you will not be eligible.
Yeah, but always feel free to reach out to us. We know this came up during the first round if we want to delve into it a little further.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a question from Michael. If you have a pre-qualified app, can you use the same land investigation results and documents from round one?
I think that question is going to require, I mean, generally, yes, but it really depends on whether the property has changed ownership, because if it has, then that's when the circle liability defense questions come in. But the documents for information about the environmental conditions of the site, that should not change from last time to this time. But that's where I would advise a quick call with CClear, Natalie's team in CClear, just to make sure we're giving you the right answer. It's hard in this context, in this webinar, for me to give any specific information. Everything that we give here is very, very general.
Great. Okay, next question from Zoe. Is the ECRG grant not made out as a lump sum? How will the funds be distributed? So it's important that it's reimbursable. Yeah, Miriam, I'll let you answer that.
Correct, Natalie. No, you're absolutely right. I think I mentioned this earlier in the webinar. We do not write you a check or transfer the allocated amount. The way it works is that as you incur eligible costs, you batch your invoices in batches of 15,000, send those to us, we approve them, process them, and the state controller's office sends you a check. You don't have to show that these invoices have been paid in order for us to reimburse them. So that sometimes requires negotiation with your vendors and your suppliers. Just because we have, I think, a 60-day to 90-day payment. Unfortunately, we have to go through two state agencies, us and the state controller's office, to get that check. But it is reimbursement based.
Great. And just a reminder, the slides and the recordings will be available on the website on Monday, and we'll also send it out through the newsletter, and the recording will be on CCLR's YouTube ECRG channel. Okay, we have a question from Paria. How about prisons? Are they eligible to apply for the grant?
For any state organization, it's a little tricky, and we would have to have a conversation. So even though generally the answer is no, there are some circumstances where a state organization could apply. So I would recommend having a conversation with CCLR. And if they fall into a nonprofit or non-state public entity or tribal category, then that's a yes. So I think it really depends on, I think, what kind of prison it is.
Okay. And we have a question from Bruce. What % of grant applicants were awarded grants in round 1 overall?
We don't have an exact number, but it was very, very high because we had enough money to fund most of our eligible applicants. And so we don't have a statistic on that. I can just say it was very significant, because as a new grant, we got almost as many applications that were eligible that we funded. And I can answer that question, I think, a little bit of a different way as well. I think our ask was about 112, and we funded about 75 million.
But some were not eligible, and things like that came up. So
that was like the bigger difference. We didn't get down to being sort of, it wasn't necessarily a competitive decision. The reduction from that 112 asked to the 75 funded was more about eligibility than anything else.
Yeah, and if it served a vulnerable community or not.
Exactly. And there were some competitive issues there, but not significant.
For current grantees, does the 60% spend requirement apply to the time of application submission, March, or award, June, July?
Oh, it's at the time of submission.
Okay, so March. Great. Michelle says, what kind of documentation is needed for a public agency? Sorry, a little noise outside. What kind of documentation is needed for a public agency to submit on behalf of a private owner?
That's a long question. I mean, because there's a lot of questions that you'd have to answer about the reuse, about the partnership, about the public entity's interest in this private property. And I think, and then there's sort of ownership documentation required. So I would say hold on to that question. And when the eligibility self-check gets released, going through that will help you answer that question more specifically.
Thanks, Miriam. Another question from Michael. Do you have a more recent land investigation if you're pre-qualified in round 1? I'm not sure what you mean by land investigation, Michael.
Yeah, maybe maybe just like a site investigation. I would ask that question a different way. I mean, I would say that enough has changed from that pre-qualifying round last year, because the pre-qualifying round ended up being significantly different with what the actual application was. And so I would say don't make any assumptions based on your qualifications of the pre-app round or the actual round one. This is a new, it's a new and updated round with new and updated criteria. So I would primarily look to the information from this round to make any decisions about your site and where you stand. Don't focus on last year's information, because, there are nuances that are different.
Okay, another question about the invoices for grantees, current grantees. Can you explain how it works if 60% of invoices are due at application, but the funds can't cover work that's been completed and paid for? Would we need to keep these invoices unpaid until funds are awarded?
Say,
go ahead, Mary.
Whoever this is, Natalie, because I can't see the chat.
Oh, it's Adam Levine, yes.
Let's have a call to answer that question, because that may be like a grantee question, and I want to understand that a little bit. So let's just set up a chat with Adam
Okay.
and discuss that.
Yeah, Adam, if you can email us at the ECRG@ccler.org email, and then we'll connect you. Or you can also email your project manager directly. That would probably be the best way.
Yeah.
So we can answer just in case there's something we're not catching. And yes, you can schedule appointments with ECRG right now. Devin, if you can put the link in the chat again, but it's live and you're welcome to start scheduling those. Are community college districts eligible? It sounds like state universities are not.
That is correct. State universities are not. And I'm not sure about community college districts. We'll have to look into that. It will, I do not know enough about state community colleges to know if they are affiliated with state organizations or if they're independent.
Yeah, I think if they're not a state agency, it will. And even Miriam said, there's always some nuance. So definitely reach out to us. Bruce has a question. Are building hazardous materials assessments, ERM surveys, included in the grant program? This is asbestos and lead-based paint generally.
No, if it's just building materials alone, it's not covered by the ECRG. ECRG really is for, ground investigation and cleanups.
Okay, great. I think that's it. We have the Calendly link there, so please, we look forward to meeting you all, and that's really brings us a lot of joy to get to work with you all one-on-one and talk about these great projects and support you all. So I think we are done. I'll hand it back to you, Miriam, to finish.
Thanks, Natalie. Thank you so much for helping me navigate all those questions. And thank you to all of you who participated and for all of your questions. These questions are really important for us because I think it helps everyone else on the webinar get a broader understanding of certain particular aspects of our program. So thank you so much for taking the time. I look forward to meeting you guys individually. I look forward to seeing you at our upcoming webinars. And most of all, I look forward to receiving your applications and hopefully funding them as well. So thank you so much for your time today, everyone. Have a good day and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Hope you have a great week.